Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I am sitting here with Russell L. Meek. I usually call him Russ. Russ and I have known each other for a really long time. We actually co-authored a book together, Trajectories, a gospel-centered introduction to Old Testament theology, back in 2018, I think is when that was published. And so now Russ got a new book out, Ecclesiastes and the Search for Meaning in an Upside Down World. And if y'all aren't familiar, I'm kind of an Old Testament guy. I got my PhD in Old Testament theological studies from Trinity. Ecclesiastes is not required reading usually. This is a really specialized area, even within Old Testament studies. And so reading this book was really enlightening for me and helpful. And so Russ and I are going to talk a little bit about that. But before we do, just thought maybe, Russ, just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you, your family, kind of what you do, where you work, that kind of stuff. And then we'll jump into talking about Ecclesiastes.
All right, cool. Well, I'm Russ, like you said. I did want to mention, since you brought up trajectories, I got a royalty payment for that book yesterday, and this
Nice.
is like $18. And so we're gonna go to McDonald's on that. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Welcome to the harsh world of authoring books, right?
Yeah, you always think you want to do it, and then you're like, wait a minute. uh,
Yeah.
uh, So I live in North Idaho, so just south of Canada. You have to call it North Idaho because if you call it Northern Idaho, people will look at you like it's like a signal, like you ain't from here, are you? Um, so I live up here with my wife and three sons, Ari, Abel, and Elijah. Abel's named after Abel and the relationship between Genesis and Ecclesiastes, so which we'll get into there. I teach Old Testament and Hebrew at William Tennant School of Theology and adjunct at a few other places. And I proofread and copy edit books. So when I was a kid, I said I wanted to teach and read books for a living. And now that I do that, I'm thinking like maybe I should have gone back in time and been like, I want to be a billionaire for a living or something like that. Since
Be a billionaire, you can teach and read books for a hobby, so.
Yes, exactly.
Well, man, like I said, I love reading the book. I think this is a really fantastic approach, and Ecclesiastes is such sort of a specialized literature. I mean, even as I, kind of read your book and then tried to go out and find additional resources on Ecclesiastes, the way people read it is sort of fairly spread. I mean, there's a wide range of approaches to the book of Ecclesiastes. So can you just give us a little bit of a summary of how you approach it, how you approach the book of Ecclesiastes, and maybe how our listeners could approach it as well?
Yeah. So essentially, I think Ecclesiastes is the most Christian book in the whole Old Testament. And I think we go wrong. We've gone wrong in reading it pessimistically, which is so kind of you have the two predominant approaches. Like one is like, man, this book is just pessimistic. The guy is saying life is worthless and meaningless. And then the other kind of baptized, more Christian approach is like everything is meaningless without God. And I think, and that's true, like everything is meaningless without God. And yet that's not what the book is saying. And so I think that we have to understand well the term translated vanity or meaningless in the book. And that's what the book I wrote is about, is understanding that term. And then once we understand that rightly, we see the book is really this realistic reflection on the way life actually is, that then urges us to cope with that life, cope with the difficulties of life through enjoying the gifts of God and living in relationship with Him.
It's interesting. I mean, I suppose I cut my teeth on the pessimistic approach, but it's never really felt right to me. And so you always see these glimpses of it in Ecclesiastes where it's like, well, no, I don't think he's being pessimistic. It feels like there's something else going on here. And so how do you see that? You talk about the Genesis shape of Ecclesiastes in the book, and then obviously connecting Havel and Abel. And so maybe help us understand that just a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So let me back up a little bit to talk about that pessimistic approach a little bit. So the reason I even wrote this book at all Is because, well, it's like a it's a popular level version of my dissertation. So basically, I
Okay.
was able to take my dissertation and take out everything that is like horrible and boring, and just keep like the and so the my dissertation went from like 300 pages to this book is like 60. So that should tell you something about the whole educational
Nice.
process and
Yeah.
everything. Um, but uh, so I started reading Ecclesiastes because I thought it was pessimistic. So I was in seminary. So this is like before I got married, I was doing my master's degree. And just before I went off to seminary, I had so like when I was like 12 years old, is the first time I ever got high. My grandmother passed away, and someone was like, "Hey, this will help you feel better," and like gave me a joint as a 12-year-old, and of course it did make me feel better. And so like that's kind of the way I learned to cope with difficulty in life, was like drugs and alcohol. And so like I graduated to like in my little like 12-year-old brain, like I knew that smoking weed was like wrong, but I did not think that like taking pills was wrong. You know what I mean? So it's like this
Sure.
weird like,
Yeah.
and so I kind of transitioned over to just like stealing medicine. Um
Okay.
and and so um so I kind of had this on again, off again relationship with drugs and alcohol. And then when I was in college, like right before I graduated college, I had this toothache. Go to the dentist, and he prescribes me Vicodin for it. And I just like took it. I hadn't been using drugs at that point, but I just like took it without even thinking about it. And then I was like, "Whoa, man, that feels really good," And so the after the surgery was done and my toothache was over, I just like rationed out my pills, and started taking them
Yeah.
recreationally, and then that led to just a lot of drug use, and drinking heavily. And so this is like, so I'm going into seminary, and in seminary living this life. And so I had this real sharp like distinction between like my school life and like the rest of my life. And it
Yeah.
caused a lot of anxiety. I was super isolated. It was like a really bad time in life. And it was at this toward the end of that time, um, I was just like, man, you know, if there's a book, a dude who wrote a book of the Bible who can say life is meaningless, then like maybe there's hope for me. And so that's why I
Yeah.
started reading Ecclesiastes, because I was just like at this point where like I didn't really want to quit using drugs, but I also obviously wasn't walking with the Lord faithfully, even though I was like going to seminary and doing the Bible stuff. And
Yeah.
uh I just, my lifestyle was just antithetical to the gospel. And then one day the Lord just like woke me up in this like, like literally I woke up from sleeping, and was the Lord was just like, spoke to me and was like, hey, like, my dad was an alcoholic too. And I just remember feeling like, man, my dad didn't like wake up one morning and say like, man, I want to ruin everybody's life that's ever close to me. So I'm just going to become a drunk. It just like happens. The way it was happening with me and had happened. And so, man, I just felt so convicted, dumped my pills down the toilet, flushed them, and then like called some friends in Colorado and was like, hey, I need help. I've got to get out of here. And they were like, hey, come stay with us for a while. Got sober, then ended up meeting my wife. And so it was like this whole fun thing. But the point of all that is, in the
Yeah.
midst of all that, I'm reading Ecclesiastes, and because I'm thinking this guy is saying life is meaningless. But then I had a professor who said, like, I don't think he's actually saying this. I think, this is a reference to Abel and the Cain and Abel narrative. And so there are like some French authors who had written on it before. And man, my mind was like blown, and so I was like, whoa, like if he's not being pessimistic, then there's like something else going on here. And for me, like growing up, learning that the way that you deal with life is by checking out. Um, it was powerful to say, like, okay, no, he's not saying life is meaningless. He's saying that life is turned upside down, but then he gives us a way forward. And that way forward is not through opiates, it's through enjoying the gifts that God gives us, like food and work and relationships, right? And so
Yeah.
that was what it's like. That's why I wrote my dissertation on Ecclesiastes. That's why I wanted to
That's
write
cool.
this book, because like I know that I'm not the only person who is like struggles with healthy coping mechanisms. And yet here, right here in the Bible, is a book that says like, hey, life can be really horrible,
Yeah.
but you don't have to like get high to make it through. There's another way, a better way, you know. But
Yeah.
I like forgot the initial question now. I feel like I
No,
was
dude.
going
I mean,
somewhere.
that was way better than the question I asked. So, um, I always find it fascinating. I mean, you know, you go to seminary, like I went to seminary too, and I mean, I chose my dissertation for totally different reasons, but it did grow out of sort of that life setting I was in and the people who had sort of built into me. And so it's sort of awesome to think that there's this book in the Old Testament that even most Old Testament scholars are a little bit, you know, unknowledgeable about. Um, and it has these amazing truths that if we just dig into it and understand it a little bit more, we get so much more out of the full counsel of God than if we just let it sit there and be the pessimistic book that doesn't have much to say to us.
Right.
So I mean, I love that story, bro. That's great.
Yeah.
Really awesome. Yeah, I hadn't heard that before. That's
Thanks.
cool. So
Oh yeah.
yeah,
Well,
you ended up being an Ecclesiastes expert, almost to prove it wasn't pessimistic.
yeah,
So
that's exactly right. Yeah. Because it's not. Yeah, and it all like hinges on this word hevel, right? Or able
yeah,
or havel, and how we understand that. And so up until so you have like these two streams of tradition, right? The Jewish interpretation and the Christian interpretation. And in Jewish interpretation, like the Hebrew term is super broad. Like I like to use the example of bread. So like if we talk about bread today, we could mean like all sorts of things. We could mean money, we could mean donuts, we could mean tortillas, we could mean biscuits, cornbread. I mean, there's like any number of things. But if we talk about, and that's kind of like hevel, a really broad range of meaning.
right. And this is the
And
term usually translated vanity, just for folks who don't know
yes,
Hebrew. So what that's the phrase we're talking about is hevel is usually translated vanity, I think, in most English translations. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, that's
Just
right.
clarify
Yeah,
that.
that's right. Thanks. I can nerd out, and forget. So,
So can I. That's how I know to
yeah,
do it.
yeah. So we take this word with a really broad range of meaning, like bread, and it's broad in Hebrew. It's even broad in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, Matthiates. It's broad in the Aramaic Targums, in Arabic interpretations. Every Jewish interpretation keeps a really broad term, but when we get to Jerome, he chooses vanitas, and then that vanitas like just dominates translation. And vanitas in Latin is like it's what where we get vanity from, and it's a very short, very small range of meaning. So we take this word bread and we essentially translate it with tortilla, and so we like narrow the range of meaning significantly. So
Yeah,
like now when we read tortilla, like we cannot think about donuts or cornbread or biscuits, right? We're only thinking about
right.
tortillas. And
Yeah,
like that's what's happened with this term. Is we've taken a word with a really broad range of meaning and translated it with a word with a really narrow range of meaning. Um, and that has kind of led us to interpret the book in a bad way, I think. Because yeah,
yeah. Well, because vanity always has generally vanity has a negative connotation. And so
yeah,
you're already
yeah,
off on this foot where, especially in contemporary world, vanity is not something that you strive after, right?
right,
And
right.
so it already sort of colors the book. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really interesting. I didn't
yeah.
know it came through the Latin, actually. I thought this was just sort of an interpretive choice that we were making, because everybody
No.
assumed it was pessimistic, but it actually drove through Jerome,
Hmm.
Vanitas, and then it carried over into vanity. How
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. And Luke, so and then it becomes this book in the Catholic tradition, like the a long time ago Catholic tradition that is used to advocate for like a monastic lifestyle. So if the world is all vanity, let's withdraw from the world and be monks or whatever, and not engage the world because it's all vanity or meaningless. Sorry, Martin Luther comes along and he's like, that's not what he's saying at all. So has a lot of strong words to say. I don't know if you've ever gone to like if you Google like Martin Luther insult generator, You can like type in stuff and it'll insult you. So anyway, it's not safe for work like this the stuff he says about Ecclesiastes. Because he's like trying to say like, no, it's not about withdrawing from the world, you know.
Gotcha.
Um, yeah. So we do get this super pessimistic reading because that word is just dominates the book. I mean,
Yeah.
if you get that wrong, you get the whole thing wrong. It's not like, and I always tell my Hebrew students, like, man, don't let me come to your church and hear you preaching like, oh, the Hebrew really means this, because I'm always like, translators are like way smarter than any of us, and they know
That's
way
right.
more, and like they do good work. But in this one case, I completely disagree, you know.
Well, and there's so many times, I would say this just in defense of translators. Yeah, something like Genesis 3:1, right? The serpent was the craftiest animal that the Lord God had made. And it's the word for crafty is arum. And you probably have a word play later on in the passage, arumim, with naked.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, how, if you're a translator, you're going to capture that? You
Right,
really
right.
don't. Like you can't capture the ambiguity of the term arum, which could be positive
Mm-hmm.
or negative. Like you've got to kind of make
Mm-hmm.
a choice. And then you're never really going to capture the wordplay unless you just get, a situation where the English words also rhyme, right? And so, yeah, I think it's kind of a yeoman's task to do the translations and
Yeah, yeah,
capturing
yeah. That's
something
right.
like Hevel, which does have this really broad sort of range of meaning and almost a whole conceptual world tied to it. Like when you're
Yeah,
talking about it
yeah.
in terms of Abel, now what you're drawing on is almost this whole story and background and symbols and concepts that are being loaded into Hevel. And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
what word are
Mm-hmm.
we going to use? What do we want
Yeah,
to say? Do we
exactly.
want to write every
Yeah.
time it appears? Do we put a paragraph in there? Like,
Right,
how
right.
is that going to work?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, how do you suggest people really think about, because obviously continuing to use vanity has its problems.
Yeah.
Is there a way that you would describe this just sort of in short terms that would help people kind of understand what's going on there?
Yeah, I think like kind of an easy shortcut would be to even use the word vapor or mist. That's like the connotation that is one of the connotations, just something that's not negative, that's not necessarily negative.
Yeah.
Of course, I love I think it'd be cool to do able or able like or ableness.
Yeah.
But then again, but if you do that, then I'm driving the interpretation. You know what I mean? And so
I do. Yeah.
um or I like the word injustice or even upside down. Um, but the one thing I think we can do that in or we should do, and this is what the biblical audience have that like we don't, is they're steeped in like a biblical worldview, right? So they
Right.
understand the book of Genesis. And so when they're reading Ecclesiastes, I go through, there's like I don't remember how many allusions, but there's like six or more what I think are really clear allusions to the book of Genesis in Ecclesiastes, right? And so, and it's like obvious when you get down to the word level and the concept level, it's like, yeah, this is definitely drawing on Genesis. And so, like, if for a biblical audience who's an oral culture and they're hearing this, like, this is going to be bringing to mind the Genesis context. So,
Right.
like, if we were to put a picture on the screen of like two dogs with a piece of spaghetti or two people with a piece of spaghetti between them, we would probably think of the Lady in the Tramp
Lady and the
movie.
Tramp.
And
Right.
so, yeah, so you don't even have to have ever seen Lady in the Tramp to like understand like that image. And so, I like found the foundational issue is like, man, we've got to have a really high biblical literacy, And so, if we can, I know that's like a really big issue. And so, but if we can get, if and we have a lot of entertainment options that biblical audience didn't have, like they couldn't watch Netflix or,
Right.
uh, you know,
Yeah.
go to a baseball game. And so they're like spending a lot more time reading and studying scripture. And so for them, like when you like paint this picture of a garden setting and are talking about a river that irrigates the crops or the trees and the trees that bear every kind of fruit, like they're immediately thinking of Genesis 1 and 2. And so like if there was some way to like make ourselves like that steeped in the biblical worldview, so that when we read Ecclesiastes, we're like, oh yeah, I know this story. And then we can start asking questions like, why is he like, why is he talking about Genesis? Why is he referring to Genesis all these different times? And then that helps us then when we get to this word hevel, and say like, oh, I mean, even like a footnote that says like this is the same name as Abel, that
Yeah.
that clues us into there might be something else going on here, right?
Yeah.
Because then, and even in Ecclesiastes, I don't think that the author is saying like is wanting us to translate Abel every time. I think he's wanting us to reflect on some aspect of the Abel story. So he's saying like,
Yeah.
when the fastest runner doesn't always win the race, in the place of wickedness you find righteousness, or in the place of righteousness you find wickedness. And he says this is hevel. He's not saying this is vanity or this is meaningless. He's saying this reflects what we already know about Abel. Like
Right.
bad things happen to good people. And so like how do we what do we do now? And so yeah, if there's some way to get us when we see that word vanity or meaningless to then go back and think like, okay, how does this reflect the Cain and Abel story? I think
Yeah.
that's the question we should be asking.
No, it's a really good point. I mean, I think, we've lost the ability to identify some of those big, broad biblical patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the area we do it best in is messianic sort of expectation, messianic
Mm-hmm.
prophecy, that kind of area. Just because Jesus, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
people are very
Pretty
interested
important.
in that. And so but the way we pattern those kind of things is sort of the way we need to pattern the rest of it. And so
Yeah.
understanding how these patterns emerge out of the Old Testament and carry over into the New, but even reverberate through the rest of the Old Testament is really crucial. And
Mm-hmm.
if
Mm-hmm.
we can't like sort of train our brains to see it, I just did a podcast for Genesis 6, or I'm sorry, Genesis 8, and it's the section where it talks about God remembers Noah, and then he sends the wind, and the English
Mm-hmm.
translation says the wind. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, that's the same ruach. That's the same
Yeah,
spirit
yeah.
that was over the waters in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
I think there are certain ways we don't do ourselves any favors by certain translation choices and not making those connections explicit all the time. But I think just in another way, it's like if we're not catching some of those connections, we're never really going to grasp how these things fit together. And
Right.
so I think it's a really important point, man. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that I think we probably would say about most Old Testament books,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and probably a lot of New Testament books. And
Yeah.
so, just for people who don't know it well, let's not assume that everybody knows the Cain and Abel story. Give us your take. Like when we look at the Cain and Abel story, there's the basic blocking and tackling of what happened, but
Mm-hmm.
what's really going on there?
Yeah. So this is so Abel is so we have to also, even in reading this story, we have to keep in mind the Pentateuch, or the whole Pentateuch, and
Yeah.
so this covenant that God makes with his people, and where he says like, hey, he calls Abraham and he's like, look, Abraham, leave your father's house, which is a really big deal in that culture too. It's not just like moving to North Idaho. It is like, leaving everything.
Right.
Um, so he says like, if you do this, I will give you land, I will give you descendants, I will give you material blessings, essentially. And then so we kind of have that promise of blessing. And then we have in the covenant that God establishes with Israel at Sinai, same sorts of things, like this list of covenant stipulations, like you got to do this, don't do this. And then if you do all of these things, and then God will give you essentially like land, descendants, money, or material wealth. And so that's the framework for reading the Genesis story. So like people who read Cain and Abel, they're gonna also hopefully like in the biblical audience is also gonna know the rest of the story too.
Right.
And so when you read Cain and Abel, you see, okay, you're primed to be thinking, all right, Abel is bringing a sacrifice to the Lord. It's the best of his flocks, right? He's bringing the best portion. And then Cain, it says he just brings some of the fruit, right? And so the issue there that isn't the type of sacrifice. It's not. It's like, so like one interpretation is like, oh well, Cain brought produce and God only accepts blood, but like that's not true. Like there are grain offerings and all of that.
Correct.
The issue there is like that Abel brings like an appropriate sacrifice, the best to the Lord. Cain just brings just something, just kind of half-heartedly does it. God accepts Cain's offering, God accepts Abel's, rejects Cain's. And again, we're thinking, yeah, like this is how it's supposed to be, right? But then straight away, Cain like gets really angry. And then God goes to him. Like, this is amazing to me. God goes to him and says, like, why are you so mad? If you do what's right, you'll be accepted,
Yeah.
And then Cain hardens his heart, just like the people in the wilderness hardened their hearts, and murders Abel. And like that is where the original audience, like if you're thinking like, okay, like it's a big it causes a lot of cognitive dissonance, because if you're like, wait a minute, if you're bringing the best offering to God and doing what God wants, you should not get murdered.
Right.
Like
right.
You should
thought
get a
this
blessing.
was supposed to turn out a little different for Abel. Like,
yeah. Exactly. And then like to add insult to injury, or to make matters worse or whatever, God puts a mark of protection on Cain, and Cain goes on to like go and have descendants and found this city. And I'm assuming he became wealthy enough at least to take care of a large family, and found a city.
Yeah.
And so it's not just a story about fratricide or killing your brother. I think it's a story about seeing that like life doesn't always go the way we expect it to go. Even knowing the promises of blessing, even knowing what God has gave to Abraham and promised to give to Abraham, it's like, man, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Like Abel is not supposed to die. Cain is supposed to suffer the punishment. Cain is supposed to be cursed, and yet he's not. And he's even given a mark of protection. And of course he is like exiled, and like, so there is like punishment there for sure. Yeah. But it's the first example, and of course in Genesis 4, so it's early on, of a life or the world turned upside down, or the failure of retribution, the retribution principle. And I think it's a powerful story because we experience this in our lives, right? Like we see, I talk about my dad. I mentioned my dad. He was like an alcoholic and a serial adulterer, or just a general, like, not a good person. My grandmother is this like salt of the earth lady who was twice widowed, raised me pretty much. I lived like a block away. Just like a really good, godly woman who cared for the poor and just did all the things that you think a Christian would do. And they both died when they're 60 years old. And like as a kid, I can remember looking at that and thinking like, how come she gets 60 years and he gets 60 years? Like that's not like that shouldn't be that way, And so it's this story right here in Genesis 4 of like sometimes things don't turn out the way that we expect them to. Or the way that they should, really. And that is all part of God's mysterious universe, So there's like a lot going on in that story. And so that's what we have to have in mind when we start to read Ecclesiastes. And it's saying it also is listing all of these situations, like where things don't work out the way they're supposed to do. He's like, oh yeah, and this too is Abel. Oh yeah, that's Abel. That's Abel. That's Abel. And so he's listing off these similar type experiences in life.
Does he ever get to Seth? I mean, as we look at that Cain and Abel narrative, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with everything you said on Cain and Abel. The way I've always read it, the sort of wrinkle I throw in is, I think a lot of people read it as Cain being jealous of Abel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. My tendency is to see it as, and this is largely because of Seth, my tendency is to see it as Cain wants to worship God the way he wants to worship God. And so by eliminating Abel as an option, God is also out of options. You can either take my sacrifice or not. But now, I put you in a corner and I'm the only one left to give you sacrifice. So take it or leave it kind of vibe. And
Yeah.
God's like, well, not really. I'm going to banish you and then give them a replacement for Abel. And so now I fixed the whole problem kind of. It still doesn't
Yeah.
negate that. I think this is Abel, like almost reading that refrain in Ecclesiastes, this is Abel, as a reference back to this unjust, or I think you put it well, upside down treatment of Abel is really interesting. But then also seeing this sort of Seth moment where it's like, oh, God's never in a box. He's always working. He's continuing to redeem. Like, this is sort of the ray of hope, so that we're not just left with Abel's a breath, and done. Does Ecclesiastes ever get to that Seth moment? Does he reference Seth? Do you see Seth in Ecclesiastes at all?
Yeah, I don't know. There is so Radisa Antic wrote an article years and years ago where it called like Cain, Abel, Seth, and the meaning of heaven and Ecclesiastes or something like that.
Okay.
So he sees like a Seth reference in I think it's Ecclesiastes 4, where you have like the two youth and then like another one rises up and becomes king or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but yeah, so he sees that. I haven't spent a whole ton of time thinking about the Seth option. That's really interesting though. That's good.
Yeah. I love the idea though, man, of reading. I mean, just before we got on this interview, I decided to read through Ecclesiastes anyway. And so, I mean, in my head, I've just got all these, this is vanity, this is vanity, this is vanity. And now sort of reframing it in my head and actually reading it as this is Abel, this is Abel, this is Abel. It's like, oh yeah, that makes so much more sense. Just having that story, rehearsing that story as you're reading it has so much more power for what Ecclesiastes is actually talking about. Well, man, what else, like, so, in the book, you deal with the Genesis background, which I think we kind of cover to a large extent, as much as we're going to dig into it in 45 minutes. Where does Ecclesiastes really take us? Right? Like, what is his point? Right? So all this life is meaningless. You kind of referred to, hey, let's just enjoy everything that God has given us, enjoy the gifts that God has given us. Is that where he sort of ends it, or is there more that we should see there?
Yeah, I think there's more. So I think his framework is life is like Abel. We live and we experience suffering and injustice, and it's terrible. But the kind of pathway through that is twofold: fearing God and keeping his commandments. Like, so the book ends with this statement: all has been heard. The whole of humanity is fear God and keep his commandments. Okay, so that is like a huge piece of the puzzle. And like in that, first is, in a lot of translations will say the whole duty of man is fear God and keep his commandments. That's not what it says in Hebrew. It says kol ha'adam, all of the man or all of humanity. And so I think that's intentional. And I think he's not saying the whole duty of man. I think he's saying like the whole, like what it means to be a human being is to live in a relationship with God. And so that fear God and keep his commandments is like shorthand in wisdom literature for having a relationship with God, right? And so I think what he's saying is, first of all, in spite of all of the kind of upside down life experiences we have, what it means to be a human being is to have a relationship with God. And so that has to characterize and frame our whole lives, is living in a relationship with him. And then now that we're in this relationship with God, who is a good father, who gives good things to those who love him, who is trustworthy and kind and generous, when he gives us things, and Ecclesiastes says six carpe diem or seize the day passages where he says, enjoy food, work, wine, and a spouse, right? And so these are all brief gifts. Like, we don't have them forever. A meal only lasts as long as the meal. Your spouse might die, right? People come and go out of our lives. But he's painting this picture, I think, that if we're in the midst of this world, this upside down, able characterized world, we, on the one hand, live in a relationship with God, and on the other hand, we look back to Eden, where they had food and relationships and work that was meaningful, and when we can engage in those things, work and time with one another, and that, then we can kind of grasp hold of Eden. But then, as new covenant believers who know that Jesus comes and dies and makes a way for us to have an even closer relationship with God, and the Spirit lives within us, we also like look forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb, right? It's where we will be feasting and enjoying relationship with God and with one another. So I think Ecclesiastes kind of stands in the middle and says, like, okay, look back to Eden and look forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And while you're on earth, here are some ways that you can kind of grab hold of heaven while you're here. And that is through like eating, drinking, working, and being with people that you love, you know? And so that's why I say it's the most Christian book of the Old Testament, because it gives us this framework for a apologetic for the Christian faith that's like really, really compelling, you know? But Christianity is not about don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go with girls who do. It's not even about like, hey, you shouldn't, you know, swallow opiates every day to make yourself feel better. Like, you shouldn't do those things. But what it's about is a vision of life that is full of really good things that God gives us. And so, and the other really cool thing is that it's not determined by like your socioeconomic status. All people can enjoy food and can enjoy work. It doesn't matter if you are, you know, running the Moody Center or swinging a hammer. Like, both of those things, like, if we can enjoy the things that we do, like, that matters, right? And like, that's the gift. The gift isn't the job or the title or the money. The gift is like the pleasure of doing the thing, you know?
Right. It's actually embedded in the thing. I think there's
Yeah.
there's real sort of wisdom in that, because one of the things that I've noticed, especially in studying Deuteronomy, let's say, you know, Deuteronomy 8 talks about God warns the people not to go into the land and you know, enjoy the cisterns they didn't dig and live in houses they didn't build and all these great, you know, wonderful things he's going to give them the land. And he basically tells them, listen, don't forget the one who gave them to you.
Right.
You know, don't forget that, because that's the, like, acknowledging me and having these things with me is the key, right? Having them without me is like, right, but having them with me is like the thing. And so one thing I wanted to kind of circle back to, you know, fear God and keep his commandments, right? That idea of fear of the Lord is another one that I think people we may have an intuitive sense of what it is, right? But it isn't like our normal language. We don't walk around and be like, hey, I hope you're fearing God today, right? Like that's, you know, we usually tend toward, let's follow Jesus or let's love one another, you know, but like fear the Lord is not regular language for us anymore. And so can you just speak a little bit about that? You said, you know, in the wisdom literature, that's kind of shorthand, right? It conveys this very particular thing. You already kind of covered some of the covenant, which I think is important background for that statement. But how would you really, you know, just shorthand explain that to folks?
Gosh, I get asked this question all the time, and it's so hard for me to answer. You'd think I would come up with like a really good answer by now, but I don't have one.
I'm glad I'm piling on.
So, all right. So I think it's relational. Like, so it's hard for me to understand because I didn't have like a good healthy relationship with my dad, and I think a parent-child relationship is the best depiction of this, because we learn from our parents, hopefully, that they love us. They give us food, they give us clothing. In a perfect world, right? They should give us food, they should give us clothing, they should keep us from running out into the street, and they should also discipline us, right? And so whenever we do things that we're not supposed to do, in Arkansas, where I grew up, you got a whooping. And my grandmother actually like made a paddle for me that said for use on Rusty when needed, and like made me take it with me and stuff. And so um so
Those were
she
the
was nice.
days, man. Those were the days.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we think about fearing God, it's we need to think about it in like that kind of relational context. Um, it is a understanding that God loves us, has our best interest in mind, and because of that, we should do what He says. But then also we know that like He can and will discipline His children, and so there is this kind of like a both and like both there are good things to being in relationship with Him. Like now, my kids are 6, 6, and 8, and like they really don't like getting in trouble because like they don't like to go to timeout. They also like don't like not being close to me, right? You know what I mean? So if there's this kind of breach in the relationship, like they want that to be better,
Yeah.
intuitively,
Right.
and so there's like that. And then so the goodness of God in the relationship on one hand, and then the other hand, the like kind of fear of punishment, which like I know that's not like necessarily the best motivator, but I think it can be a good motivator.
Yeah.
In so I remember whenever so I had not been using drugs for like years at this point. I had my oldest son was born, and I got super sick and went to the doctor, and I was like coughing and just like really sick. So I tell the doctor like, hey, I have a history of like opiate abuse. Like, don't give me anything with like if I have to just suffer through it, that's fine. I can't
Sure.
take anything with like codeine or anything like that in it. And so the doctor's like, okay, that's fine. And then he writes me a prescription for cough medicine with codeine in it. And so I'm like sitting there on like and then he leaves, and then I'm like sitting there on the edge of the bench or bed or whatever it is in the doctor's office, and like sweat is like literally coming off of my forehead because I'm like sitting here looking at this thinking like it would feel so good to get high. Like I could just go get this prescription filled. I wouldn't even have to tell my wife. I could just take it. Like nobody
Right.
would know. And I'm like just tore up on the inside thinking about this. And then I remember like, dude, I have a wife now. I have a son. I have a job, for crying out loud. There are all these good things God has given me. And the like fleeting pleasure of getting high is so costly. Like
Yeah.
God could take all of these things away from me. God could even kill me for turning my back on His like goodness and rescue of me from this sin. And so like I didn't fill the prescription. I like called my
Yeah.
wife, told her, hey, the doctor gave me this, and then and so I didn't fill it. But the reason was not because like, oh man, I'm so spiritual and have this overwhelming love for God. The reason was
Yeah.
like I didn't want to lose the good things God had given me. So like so that like fear of God's
With you.
discipline like kept me from sin in that moment, and I mean ideally it would have been like the other way around, like man, I love God so much, how can I turn away from Him? But that's not where I was at that point, so it was like a really good thing to
Yeah.
know that God could discipline me.
It's interesting, man. I because I've thought a lot about the fear of the Lord, and the one thing I've ran across recently is out of cognitive psychology, and they do this stuff called relevance realization. So the idea is that like if I need a mode of transportation, I go out in my garage and I see a bicycle, but I don't know how to ride a bicycle. That's a completely irrelevant mode of transportation for me. Right. It
Mhm,
just doesn't factor into my decisions anymore because I can't ride it, even if it's the only I know it's a mode of transportation, it's just not a mode of transportation for me.
mhm,
Right. And so as I started reading through some of that like relevance realization thing, even the story you just told, it's like, what if fear of the Lord is about a deep, abiding awareness that God is infinitely more relevant than anything else in our lives.
mhm,
And so what you have is you have both sides of that included in the relevance aspect, right?
mhm,
In that there's nothing that you could do that would be better than following God's ways.
mhm,
And if you choose those, there's probably going to be negative consequences that come along with that because A, it's just not as good, right?
mhm,
And B, there will be consequences.
Right.
right? But then you look at it the other way and you're like, yeah, but if God is infinitely more relevant than anything else in my, any other situation I may be facing, following him makes perfect sense, because that's always going to be my best move. Like, this is the strategy you just can't get away from. And so yeah, I mean, I think your story kind of reinforces that for me. It's like, you're both sides of God, right? The blessing and the consequences, right, factor into this idea of what it is to fear the Lord. And it really is highlighting, look, God's superiority, God's infinite relevance to us in any given moment is just so surpassing anything else, that it doesn't
Right.
make any sense to opt in to anything but him, right? He always stays in the foreground. He's always relevant to us. And so he always factors into our decisions, whereas other things might not.
Right. Right. It's
Yeah,
good.
it's really
It's really
good.
good. Yeah.
Well, bro, any last words on Ecclesiastes? We're kind of getting to the end of our time here, but what would you say? Maybe this question I've got in my head. How you talked about biblical literacy. We've talked about a little bit of patterns. We talked about Havel in Ecclesiastes, and that probably gives people a pretty good framework to read it. But any other suggestions on how people can really access this book and understand it really, really well? Obviously, buying Ecclesiastes and the Search for Meaning in an Upside Down Life from Amazon.com by Russell L. Meek would help. But anything outside of that, like how would you suggest somebody to approach the book of Ecclesiastes?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is, as much as possible, breaking out of that pessimistic understanding of it. Even if you just say like vapor or mist, which is the connotation of the word. If just try as much as possible to read the book not pessimistically, but rather as a reflection on life as we experience. So a realistic reading of the book rather than pessimistic reading of the book. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool, man. Well, are there other places you want people, where can people find you? I mean, I know your book is available on Amazon. Is it available other places? You just got it up on Amazon?
It should be everywhere. I mean, well, not
Okay.
everywhere, but like, all the places.
All the normal spots.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's Ecclesiastes and the Search for Meaning in an Upside Down World by Russell
yeah.
Meek. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. So if you're interested in buying the book, which I would definitely encourage, you can check it out there. Anywhere else folks can find you, man? Do you have a website you want to plug or anything like that?
Yeah, I have a website, russmeek.com, that I share my like dorky nerd academic writings and try to write stuff that is more for like everyday people as well. Focusing on how to live the Old Testament.
Nice. Well, we'll link that in the show notes as well. So everybody, definitely a guy whose writing is worth knowing. And Russ, really appreciate you taking the time to be on today, man. This was great to catch
Yeah.
up with you a little bit and just have a conversation with another Old Testament geek.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Hey, thanks for tuning in to Thinking Christian this week. Check out Russ's book, and we'll catch you next time on the next episode. Take care.